Hello, this is Bits and Pieces. I will be your host, Jasper, and this video we are going to be speaking about motherboards and form factors. Those two are things that go hand in hand with each other. They are things like they go with each other very well, and you can't have one without the other because motherboards are all built towards a specific form factor. What a form factor is specifically is a form factor is the different size at which your PC is built, and that includes both the PC case and the motherboard that you are going to be putting inside of that case. These motherboards are built to fit form factors that the cases are made because you need these landing screws, that's what they're called. They're screws that anchor the motherboard onto the socket in the case to make sure that the motherboard doesn't move around when you decide to move the computer or put it where you want to put it. Every motherboard is unique. That is one thing you need to keep in mind, is that every motherboard is unique. It may fit these general descriptions, but it may or may not have exactly the same layout or setup or values in terms of certain things. And it is essential to have the documentation of the motherboard that you purchase, which will come with the motherboard that you buy. It is essential to have that, and I will go into more detail about that later in this presentation. The first major form factor is the form factor known as ATX. An ATX board is typically 12 inches by 9.6 inches. Those boards are the most common. You see them everywhere. It is the most popular form factor to use for motherboards and PC cases. Typically, they have 4 slots for your RAM sticks that you're going to be putting into the PC. I will be making a different video going into more detail about that later. And there is 5 to 7 expansion slots, which RAM slots are typically to the right of the CPU socket on the motherboard, and expansion slots are typically below the CPU socket on the board. That is just a general rule of thumb. That is typical, but it is not always the case, as some motherboards may have the CPU socket in alternative locations. ATX motherboards may or may not have integrated graphics built into the board, as some PCs have graphics and other input-output built onto the motherboard, and not every motherboard has it, and ATX boards may or may not, but some are almost required to have them. For example, the micro ATX will almost always have integrated graphics. Micro ATX is the same as an ATX board, except it is slightly smaller, being 9.9 by 9.9 inches. It is backwards compatible with ATX cases, so any case that is made for the ATX form factor will have landing pins for the micro ATX form factor, and it will fit an micro ATX board inside. Micro ATX boards have the same number of RAM slots with 4, and the expansion slots will be typically lower because of the limited space of the micro ATX board. They are in the same locations, or they should be in the same locations. Not always, but they typically are. And the maximum expansion slots of a micro ATX board is typically 4. The next major form factor is a mini ITX board. It is the smallest form factor at about 6.6 by 6.6 inches. Once again, backwards compatible with most ATX form factors. It has 2 RAM slots instead of 4, and has 1 expansion slot typically. And in older builds of the mini ITX, they used to use these things called riser cards, which is a card that you put into the expansion slot and has 2 expansion slots built into it, and you can run expansion cards parallel to the main motherboard. But that is not as commonly used anymore. It is not as common to see in most PC builds of the ITX form factor now. Most all mini ITX boards have integrated graphics built into the motherboard. And the last major form factor that is typically used is a eATX board, which stands for Extended ATX board. It is the largest, with boards that are spec'd out to be 12 inches by 13 inches, which is not always the case, but typically that is what they're supposed to be spec'd for. They typically have more RAM and expansion slots than an ATX board, which is typically 8 RAM slots. It can have integrated graphics, but there is most definitely enough space for an additional graphics card in case an eATX board does not have integrated graphics built into the board. Due to the size of an eATX board being larger than a standard ATX board, eATX is not backwards compatible with ATX, but it is the other way around, so you can fit ATX boards on eATX form factor cases typically. So now that you're looking at all these different form factors, you're probably wondering, what should I choose for my PC form factor? Should I use eATX, ATX, ITX, mini ATX? And the answer is, depending on what you want to do with that computer, that is what will determine what you should get for your PC. For example, if you're only doing light office work and don't intend on doing anything particularly intensive on the PC, it is likely that a micro ATX would be sufficient. You wouldn't need anything more powerful than a micro ATX board on the system. Most standard work, you'll probably want an ATX board. And for home theaters, you'll want a mini ITX because those are small, have the small form factor, and aren't as loud as standard. They're not as loud as standard boards and form factors. And if you're planning on doing some heavy intensive gaming, you'll likely want the extra customizability and extra expansion slot space of the eATX board and the additional RAM as well. Just a side note here, when looking at things online, you will likely see that RAM slots are also referred to as DIMM slots, DIMM, and expansion slots are also known as PCIe slots. So expansion slots and RAM slots are synonymous with those two other terms, DIMM and PCIe. So in case you go and look for these online elsewhere, just know that a DIMM is a RAM slot and a PCIe is an expansion slot. And the major slots that you'd find on a motherboard, transitioning now into the motherboard side, the main slots you'll find here are typically the CPU socket, RAM or DIMM slots, expansion or PCIe slots, integrated graphics if the motherboard has it. You'll find various fan sockets to plug in case fans. You'll have SATA cable slots to plug in your hard drives, and case pins to plug your case into the motherboard for the external buttons, and case USB slots for the external USB slots on the case if your case has them. Things to keep in mind with your motherboard is that you are going to want to keep the documentation of your motherboard in case certain parts aren't compatible with the board. Your motherboard's documentation will tell you if there are certain CPUs that are not compatible with it. It will be detailed in your documentation, and you'll want to consult it when picking out CPU or other parts that may not be compatible with it. You will want to consult the documentation. And also you will want to consult the documentation to be able to arrange how the case pin connectors from the case should connect onto the board to ensure that the buttons all do what they're intended to do.